The air in York was thick with the scent of wood smoke and salt water, a mingling aroma that spoke of the city's dual nature, a bustling trade center, where Anglo-Saxons and Vikings coexisted in a fragile balance. York lay at the heart of a kingdom that was both on the edge of an empire and yet deeply rooted in its ancient, tribal past. In the early 11th century, the city, with its towering walls and ancient churches, had seen its share of battles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. It was here, amidst the echoes of warriors' footsteps and the murmur of political intrigue, that Ælfgifu of York was born. Ælfgifu came into the world not as a mere child, but as the daughter of Ælfhelm, one of the most powerful earls in Northumbria, and Wulfrun, whose bloodline was steeped in nobility. Her family's influence stretched far beyond the borders of their homeland, from the rolling hills of Northumbria to the icy fjords of Scandinavia. The daughter of such a house could hardly escape the weight of her heritage, a heritage that promised both power and peril in equal measure. As a young girl, Ælfgifu's world was one of contrasts. The shadow of Viking raids loomed over her childhood. Yet she also grew up in the firm embrace of Anglo-Saxon traditions. It was an era when the forces of England were slowly, inexorably, being drawn into the orbit of Denmark and Norway, as the Vikings, once invaders, began to settle and establish their rule. Ælfgifu's early years were defined by these shifting tides, a time when the future of the English kingdoms hung in the balance between the old ways and the new. But it was not the shifting political landscape alone that shaped Ælfgifu's destiny. From an early age, she was imbued with a sense of ambition, a knowledge that her birthright was not merely to survive, but to wield influence. She watched her father, Ælfhelm, navigate the treacherous waters of Anglo-Saxon politics, a world filled with rivalries, assassinations, and the constant threat of Viking conquest. Her mother, Wulfrun, was no less astute, ensuring that her daughter was prepared for a world where power was held not just by blood, but by wit, diplomacy, and force of will. In the court of York, Ælfgifu learned the subtle arts of negotiation, the delicate dance of alliances and enmities. Yet, she was also acutely aware of the dangers that came with her position. Her family's ties to both the Anglo-Saxon nobility and the rising power of the Viking kingdoms made her a valuable pawn in the Game of Thrones. It was a game she would come to understand all too well, a game that would soon thrust her into the heart of one of the most volatile and dangerous periods in the history of the British Isles. Ælfgifu's life was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. Her father's untimely death would leave her family vulnerable, and soon, the power struggles of the Viking North would threaten to engulf her. But Ælfgifu, even as a young woman, was not one to be easily swept aside. She would rise, like a storm on the northern seas, to claim her place in the turbulent world of kings and warriors, where bloodlines were tested by battle and fate was decided by the sharpness of a sword. This is the story of Ælfgifu of York, a woman who was born into a world on the brink of transformation, and who would navigate its shifting tides with courage, cunning, and an unyielding will. It is a story of love and loss, of power and betrayal, of ambition and sacrifice. Ælfgifu's journey would take her far from the walls of York, across the icy fjords of Norway and the battlefields of England, where the destinies of kings and queens, warriors and statesmen, were written in blood. But this is not just the story of a princess. It is the story of a woman who, in an age where women were often seen as little more than pawns in the hands of men, carved out her own path, one that would forever alter the course of history. The sun had barely risen over the rugged hills of Northumbria when Ælfgifu took her first breath. It was the year 1002, a time when the land was still recovering from the bloody Viking raids of previous decades. Yet the shadow of Norsemen never fully lifted. York, a city both proud and vulnerable, bore the marks of both Saxon and Viking hands. And Ælfgifu, the daughter of Ælfhelm, was born into a world on the cusp of change. Her family's bloodline ran deep within the annals of Northumbria's noble history. intertwined with the fates of kings and warriors. Her father, Ælfhelm, was one of the most powerful earls in the kingdom, a man whose influence reached far beyond the borders of York. His counsel was sought by the Anglo-Saxon kings, yet his enemies, many of them Vikings, kept a watchful eye on his every move. It was said that Ælfhelm had the ear of King Æthelred, but no alliance was ever without its dangers. Ælfhelm was a man of towering presence, with a mind as sharp as the blade he wielded. He ruled his lands with a combination of strategic cunning and sheer force. Yet those who underestimated his quiet resolve were often surprised by his ability to turn the tides of power in his favor. Ælfgifu inherited much of his temperament. Her mind was quick, her resolve unwavering, and her presence, though softer than her father's, held a quiet authority that could not be ignored. As a child, she had learned the subtle art of negotiation, often sitting at the edges of her father's court, watching him as he navigated the labyrinthine world of politics and war. But it was not only her father who shaped Ælfgifu's early years. Her mother, Wulfrun, was a woman of remarkable lineage in her own right. Descended from the great Anglo-Saxon nobility, Wulfrun's role in Ælfgifu's life was equally formative. She taught her daughter the intricacies of courtly manners, the ways of influence, and the quiet strength required to be a woman in a world dominated by men. Wulfrun had known the weight of power from both sides, for she was not only a noblewoman but also the daughter of a man who had been caught up in the blood-soaked drama of Anglo-Saxon politics. Under her mother's watchful eye, Ælfgifu learned to wield her beauty and charm as weapons, just as much as she learned to read the subtle shifts in power that echoed through the halls of her father's court. Wulfrun often said that Ælfgifu's greatest weapon would be her ability to observe without being seen, to understand the motivations of others without speaking a word. And it was this silent observance, this quiet power, that would serve Ælfgifu well in the years to come. The city of York itself was a reflection of Ælfgifu's dual heritage, Anglo-Saxon in name, but Viking in spirit. Situated on the banks of the River Ouse, it had once been a powerful Viking stronghold, the heart of the kingdom of Jorvik. Though the Saxons had reclaimed the city nearly a century earlier, the Viking influence remained entrenched in the very fabric of its streets and buildings. In Ælfgifu's childhood, she could often hear the distant clang of iron as blacksmiths worked their anvils, a sound that was as familiar to her as the church bells that rang throughout the city. York's markets, bustling with merchants from across the seas, were a reminder of the city's strategic importance. Its location at the crossroads of trade routes made it a key point for both Saxons and Vikings alike. It was a city that understood the necessity of alliances and the brutal consequences of breaking them. And for Ælfgifu, this was not just a backdrop. It was the very stage upon which her life would unfold. From a young age, Ælfgifu had an uncanny ability to sense the currents of tension that ran beneath the surface of even the most ordinary conversations. It was during the spring of her 10th year that she first became aware of the dangerous dance unfolding between the Saxons and the Vikings, a dance that had begun long before her birth but was now entering a new and volatile chapter. Her father, Ælfhelm, was a key player in these delicate negotiations, though no one would speak of it openly in front of her. She learned of her father's rise to prominence not through grand tales or boastful speeches, but through quiet conversations overheard in the corridors of the manor. There were whispers about his involvement in the growing tensions with King Æthelred, his subtle maneuverings to secure the future of his family against the rising tide of Viking influence. Ælfgifu knew that her father's life was a careful balance, one misstep away from bringing disaster. But despite the danger that loomed on the horizon, her father never showed fear. He was a man who had fought many battles, both in the field and in the courts, and each time, he had emerged victorious. Ælfhelm's reputation was built on years of careful diplomacy and the strength of his alliances, but also on his unflinching determination to protect those he loved. He often told Ælfgifu that the only true loyalty that mattered was the loyalty of blood, a lesson she would never forget. The Saxon court was a treacherous place, And while Ælfhelm trusted King Athelred, he knew that alliances could shift with the wind, and one day, they might no longer be enough. As Ælfgifu grew older, the realities of her father's position became clearer. She could see the lines of care etched deeply into his face, the weight of power slowly wearing away the light in his eyes. The fragile peace that had existed between the Saxons and Vikings was beginning to fray, and Ælfgifu could feel the tension in the air like a thunderstorm waiting to break. It was in the winter of 1014, when Ælfgifu was just 12 years old, that the first true sign of trouble came. Her father, ever watchful of the shifting political winds, began to receive more frequent visits from Viking emissaries. The Danes, led by King Nut, were growing stronger, and their eyes were now fixed firmly on England. The fragile Anglo-Saxon kingship seemed weak in comparison to the might of Nut and his army, and Ælfgifu's father was being drawn deeper into the web of power struggles that would define the coming years. One day, Ælfgifu overheard her father speaking to one of his closest advisors in a low voice, the words heavy with concern. "The time will come when the Vikings will take more than our land. They will take our very future." Ælfhelm's words haunted her for days, and she understood, as her father did, that the days of relative peace in Northumbria were numbered. The Danes were not content with raiding, they sought to rule. The tension finally boiled over in 1015, when Ælfgifu's life changed forever. Her father, Ælfhelm, was betrayed by those he had once considered allies. As Nut's forces gained ground in England, Ælfgifu's father was imprisoned and executed under mysterious circumstances. The blow was swift, and Ælfgifu, now only 13, found herself thrust into a world of violence and betrayal. Her family was left shattered, and Ælfgifu's grief was deep and unrelenting. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of her father's death, Ælfgifu did not give way to despair. Instead, she steeled herself for the battles yet to come. She had learned much from Ælfhelm, lessons in power, in survival, and in the brutal ways of the world. Now, more than ever, she knew that her future would not be decided by fate or by kings, but by the choices she made in the coming days. And with that, Ælfgifu began to forge her path, one that would lead her far from York and into the heart of the Viking world. The winter of 1015 was colder than most. The bitter winds swept across the northern reaches of England, biting through the heavy cloaks and fur-lined hoods of the warriors who had gathered on the outskirts of York. Ælfgifu had heard the rumors in the days that followed her father's death. Whispers of Viking ships seen on the horizon, of the ruthless King Nut tightening his grip on the kingdom, and of an inevitable clash that would come sooner rather than later. What was once the heart of her father's domain now felt like a battleground, and Ælfgifu found herself caught in the tumultuous currents of a war she had never anticipated. In the weeks after her father's execution, Ælfgifu was forced to confront the harsh realities of her situation. Though she was the daughter of one of Northumbria's most powerful noble families, her title meant little now. Her family had been torn apart by betrayal, and with her father's death, Ælfgifu's position was tenuous at best. King Nut's forces had already begun to seize control of northern England, and her mother, Wulfrun, saw no choice but to send Ælfgifu away from York, to the safety of her relatives further south. But Ælfgifu was not one to cower in the shadows. Her mother's instructions were clear: seek safety and wait for the storm to pass. Yet Ælfgifu had learned from the most powerful people in her life that waiting for things to change was never the answer. She would not be a passive observer in her own fate. As the snow continued to fall over the city of York, Ælfgifu began to hear rumors of her own. Word had spread quickly among the Saxon lords that King Nut had claimed the throne of England. His Danish forces were sweeping through the north, defeating every Anglo-Saxon resistance in their path. Ælfgifu knew that this would not be a short conflict. This would be the struggle that determined the future of the entire kingdom. But there were other rumors. Two rumors of an alliance between the Norse and the Saxons. There were whispers of a man named Olaf Haraldsson, a prince from the far north who was said to be gathering an army to retake his kingdom of Norway. This man, they said, might be the key to turning the tide against Knut's forces. Ælfgifu listened closely to these rumors, and as much as she hated to admit it, she saw an opportunity. The Vikings had come to England for conquest, but their ambitions reached even farther, into the heart of Scandinavia. If she could somehow make contact with Olaf, perhaps there was a way to rally the forces of the north, to build a new power base, one that might rival Knut's growing empire. In the midst of this swirling chaos, Ælfgifu was not alone in her thoughts. The political landscape of England was in turmoil, and as a young woman with royal blood and a sharp mind, she knew that she had a role to play. She began to move in secret, reaching out to old allies of her father's who were still loyal to the Saxon cause. But it was a dangerous game. There were too many enemies, too many people who would see her as nothing more than a pawn. And yet, she was determined to prove them wrong. A few months later, Ælfgifu was summoned by a trusted messenger to meet with a group of her father's loyalists in a remote estate on the outskirts of York. She was cautious, knowing that any meeting could be a trap, but she had little choice. The message had been clear. There was still hope for the Saxon cause, and there were those who believed that Ælfgifu could rally support among the northern lords. If she could prove her worth, they would stand with her. The estate was surrounded by thick woods, and as Ælfgifu arrived, she felt the weight of the decision she had made. Inside, a group of men, all battle-worn and grim, stood waiting for her. They were the remnants of the old Saxon Guard, loyal to her father and to the cause of Northumbrian independence. Among them was a man named Edric, a former warrior in her father's service, now serving as an advisor. His face was scarred, his eyes hard, but Ælfgifu knew him to be a man of honor. "Edric," she said, her voice steady, despite the fluttering nerves in her chest. "I have come to hear your plan." Edric looked her over, studying her with the same wariness he had shown her father. "You are brave, my lady," he said finally, "but courage alone will not win this war. You must understand, Knut is no ordinary king. He has the support of all the Danish lords, and he is a man who knows how to crush his enemies. This will not be a simple rebellion. It will be a fight for the future of England." Ælfgifu nodded. She knew the stakes all too well. "And you believe that I can lead this rebellion?" Edric gave a slow, almost reluctant nod. "Not alone, but you are the key to rallying the northern lords, the only ones who still remember the old ways, the Saxon ways. If we can unite them, we might stand a chance." It was then that Ælfgifu made her decision. She would no longer hide in the shadows, waiting for the storm to pass. She would take up her father's mantle, and she would fight. But she knew that to defeat Knut, she would need allies, and that meant reaching out to Olaf Haraldsson. The journey to Norway was treacherous. The ship that carried Ælfgifu and a small group of her most trusted supporters cut through the icy waters of the North Sea, its sails billowing in the bitter wind. Ælfgifu had not spoken much during the voyage. Her mind was focused on the task ahead. She had to make contact with Olaf. But the question remained, would he trust her? She was a woman, unusual in the realm of warriors and kings, and yet she was also the daughter of Ælfhelm, one of the most powerful lords in Northumbria. In the world of men, she was both a symbol of power and an enigma. When they finally reached the shores of Norway, Ælfgifu was met with a world unlike any she had known. The kingdom of Norway, though beautiful, was also wild and untamed, a place where alliances were forged with steel and betrayal was as common as the fjords themselves. Olaf Haraldsson was no stranger to such politics. He had come to the throne through bloodshed and ambition, and his rise had not been without sacrifice. But it was Olaf's ambition that Ælfgifu now sought to harness. His army was growing, and he was a man who could challenge Knut's rule. But he was also a man who knew the value of alliances. It was a delicate game Ælfgifu had to play, but she had learned much from her father. She had watched him build alliances, and she understood the art of persuasion. She had no choice but to put her faith in those lessons now. The first meeting with Olaf was held in a great hall in the heart of Norway. A long house filled with the smell of roasting meat and the sounds of men speaking in hushed tones. Olaf stood before her, tall and commanding, his presence filling the room as though he were born to rule. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You are Ælfgifu of York," Olaf said, his voice low but steady, "the daughter of Ælfhelm, who was once a thorn in the side of the Danes." Ælfgifu nodded, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am, and I come to you now with a proposition, an alliance." Olaf raised an eyebrow. "You wish to join forces with me?" Ælfgifu's voice was calm, measured. "I do. We both have enemies in common. Nut is spreading his power across England, and the Saxons are divided. But if we can unite the northern lords, we can create a force that even Nut cannot defeat." Olaf studied her for a long moment, the firelight flickering in his eyes. Finally, he spoke. "And what do you ask in return?" Ælfgifu took a deep breath. This was the moment that would decide everything. "I ask for your support in retaking York, and for your help in securing the future of Northumbria." The room fell silent as Olaf considered her words. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. We shall see if your plan has merit." The winds of change were relentless, tearing across the open sea as Ælfgifu's ship made its way back from Norway to England. The alliance with Olaf Haraldsson had been forged, though tenuous. It held promise. The Norse king's forces, bolstered by Ælfgifu's loyalists and the scattered remnants of Saxon warriors, were growing in strength. Yet, even as she sailed, Ælfgifu could feel the weight of the coming storm pressing against her chest. The struggle to reclaim York, to rebuild her father's legacy, was not a battle she could win with arms alone. The heart of the conflict lay within the shifting tides of loyalty, power, and betrayal. For weeks, she had strategized with her closest allies, carefully mapping out their plans to seize the city. York, still a key stronghold for the Saxons, was under the tight control of Nut's forces. The Danes had already begun fortifying their position, establishing a grip that seemed impossible to break. But Ælfgifu knew better than to think Nut's hold on the city was absolute. It was never the size of the army that mattered, it was the will behind it. And Ælfgifu's will was as unyielding as the stone walls of York itself. In the months following her meeting with Olaf, Ælfgifu returned to her former home, now under the shadow of foreign rule. She had spent long years watching from the sidelines as others shaped the destiny of the kingdoms. But now, she was no longer a bystander. The time had come for her to take her place in history, as her father had once done, and to reclaim the city that was both her birthright and her greatest challenge. Upon arriving in England, Ælfgifu received word of the growing discontent among the Saxon lords. Many had lost faith in King Æthelred, whose indecision had allowed Nut's forces to grow stronger. A new alliance seemed possible, one that could shift the power dynamics back in favor of the Saxons, but it would require a delicate balance of force and diplomacy. The lords, broken and divided by years of Viking conquest, had no unified leader. Ælfgifu would have to present herself not just as a figurehead of rebellion, but as someone capable of leading them through the chaos and into the fight against Nut. Her first move was to seek out the influential men who still held sway over the northern lords. The estates of Northumbria, though under Danish control, still held some loyalty to the old Saxon bloodlines. Ælfgifu made her way to the house of Edric, the former warrior who had once fought alongside her father. Though a man of considerable power, Edric's loyalty had always been in question, as many of the northern lords had been prone to shifting allegiances. Depending on which way the winds blew, Ælfgifu knew that to succeed, she would need to win Edric's trust. But that would not come easily. Edric's estate lay on the outskirts of York, a sprawling complex of stone buildings and guarded courtyards. Upon her arrival, Ælfgifu was met by a cold, indifferent gaze, a look that had been the hallmark of Edric's demeanor for as long as she could remember. His rough hands, weathered from years of warfare, rested on the hilt of his sword as he met her in the great hall. "I never thought I would see you here again, Lady Ælfgifu," he said, his voice gravelly and filled with suspicion. "You've come to reclaim your father's legacy, haven't you? You've come to stir the pot of war once more." Ælfgifu met his gaze, her resolve firm. "I have not come to stir anything, Edric. I have come because I believe that we still have a chance to retake York, to retake Northumbria from the grip of the Danes." Edric smirked, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something close to doubt. "Perhaps. And you think that a woman can lead this rebellion? You think you can rally the lords to your side? They will never follow a woman." Ælfgifu, her jaw tightened. "They will follow strength, and strength is not determined by gender. Edric, it is determined by the courage to do what must be done. The Saxon blood that runs through my veins is no different from the blood that runs through yours." There was a pause, and then Edric's features softened, just slightly. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps we have lost our way. But be warned, Lady Ælfgifu, if we are to stand against Nut, it will take more than just words." Ælfgifu nodded, knowing that the path ahead would require far more than speeches and promises. She would have to prove herself, not just with words, but with actions. Over the following days, she met with several key lords of Northumbria, gathering support wherever she could. Some, like Edric, were swayed by her resolve. Others, however, remained aloof, still reluctant to believe that a woman could lead them to victory. But Ælfgifu was undeterred. She knew that her father's name still carried weight, and she would use it to her advantage, weaving a network of alliances that would eventually form the backbone of her army. At the same time, Ælfgifu's forces began to grow. With Olaf's support, she had been able to secure a small but well-trained group of Norse warriors who were eager for battle. The Viking presence in York was strong, but their loyalty to Nut was not absolute. Many of the Norsemen had come to England seeking wealth and land, but their allegiances could be bought with the right promises. Ælfgifu knew that if she could rally enough of them to her cause, she would be able to launch an assault on York. The plan was simple. They would strike swiftly, catching the Danes off guard before they had a chance to reinforce their position. But the stakes were high, and failure would mean the end of Ælfgifu's cause, and likely her life. The night before the battle, as Ælfgifu stood on the balcony of her camp overlooking the shadowed hills, she felt a deep sense of foreboding. The sky above her was dark, as though the heavens themselves were preparing for the violence to come. The cold air nipped at her skin, but it was not the chill of the wind that unsettled her. It was the weight of what she was about to undertake. If she succeeded, she would reclaim her birthright and restore her family's legacy. If she failed, she would be nothing more than a forgotten name, swallowed up by history. As dawn broke over the hills, Ælfgifu gave the signal to advance. With the first clash of steel against steel, Ælfgifu's rebellion had begun. The battle for York would test her mettle as never before, but with her will unshakable, and her allies rallying to her side, she was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. This was not just a battle for York, it was a battle for her place in history. The clash of swords echoed through the streets of York, the sound reverberating off the stone walls that had once been a symbol of Saxon strength. Ælfgifu stood at the front of her forces, her heart pounding with the rhythm of battle. The air was thick with the scent of blood, iron, and the smoky haze of burning buildings. Her troops, a mixture of Norsemen and Saxon loyalists, surged forward, their war cries joining the din of the fight. This was no longer a simple raid, it was a rebellion, a desperate bid to reclaim the city that had once belonged to her father. At the head of the army, Ælfgifu led with determination, her sharp eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of weakness in the Danish forces. She had known this would be no easy task. The Danes had fortified their position well, and their warriors were seasoned, battle-hardened, but she also knew that the element of surprise was on her side. They had struck under the cover of darkness. launching their assault just as the first light of dawn had begun to creep over the horizon. The Danes had not been prepared for such an attack, and that had given Ælfgifu the advantage. For hours, the battle raged. The streets of York became a labyrinth of blood-soaked cobblestones, where men clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Ælfgifu fought fiercely, her sword cutting through the chaos as she carved a path through the enemy lines. But despite their initial success, the Saxon forces were slowly being pushed back. The Danes, though caught off guard at first, were regrouping, rallying under the command of their general, a ruthless warrior named Sven, who had quickly managed to organize a counterattack. Ælfgifu's breath came in short, labored bursts as she fought on, her muscles aching from the exertion. She had never known war to be this unforgiving. The battle was no longer about honor or glory, it was about survival. Her thoughts flickered to her mother, to the people of Northumbria who had placed their hopes in her. She could not fail them. "Lady Ælfgifu," Edric's voice cut through the din of the battle. He was shouting to her from across the field, his shield raised as he fought off a group of Danish soldiers. "We need to fall back. The Danes are regrouping." For a moment, Ælfgifu hesitated. Her heart ached at the thought of retreating. This was her city, her birthright. She could not abandon it so easily. But as she looked around, she saw the truth in Edric's eyes. The Saxon forces were faltering, and their momentum was slipping away. She could not afford to throw away the lives of her men on a hopeless charge. With a grim nod, she raised her sword and called for a retreat. "Fall back," she shouted, her voice carrying over the battlefield. "Regroup at the rally point." The Saxon forces slowly pulled back, retreating toward the edge of the city where they had set up a temporary camp. The Danes pursued, but the Saxons were faster, using the narrow alleys and familiar streets of the city to their advantage. Ælfgifu's heart pounded as she led the withdrawal, her mind racing. This was a temporary setback, nothing more. She would regroup, reorganize, and strike again. But as the sun began to set on the blood-soaked battlefield, a cold dread settled over her. The siege was not going as planned. The Danes had proven to be more formidable than she had anticipated. And worse still, there were whispers that some of her own men were wavering, questioning her leadership. There were always those who would question authority in the heat of battle. But Ælfgifu could not afford dissent. If her forces turned against her now, the rebellion would crumble. The next few days were filled with tension as Ælfgifu and her advisors, including Edric and several other lords, met to discuss their next move. The walls of York loomed large in the distance, the city now a symbol of both hope and despair. Ælfgifu was not one to be easily deterred, but she could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The battle for York was not over, but it was growing more difficult with every passing hour. "We cannot afford another direct assault," Edric said, his voice low and filled with concern. "We need to wait for reinforcements. We need more men, more supplies, or we risk being overrun." Ælfgifu nodded, her mind already turning over possible solutions. She had sent word to Olaf in Norway, requesting additional support, but it would take time for his forces to arrive. In the meantime, she had to hold York at all costs. But there was something else, something far more dangerous that Ælfgifu had to contend with. Among her own ranks, there were those who were beginning to question her leadership. She had been a woman in a man's world, and while she had managed to win the loyalty of many, there were still those who believed that she was not fit to lead them. In the heat of battle, these doubts could be deadly. One evening, as Ælfgifu walked through the camp, she overheard a conversation between two of her captains. They spoke in low tones, but their words were unmistakable. "She cannot lead us to victory," one of the captains muttered. "She's too inexperienced. We need a true warrior, not some noblewoman playing at being a queen." Ælfgifu's heart sank, but she did not let her emotions show. She was not one to shrink from a challenge. She had heard rumors before, rumors of dissent, of men who sought to replace her with someone they believed was more capable. But she could not allow this to fester. She had to act, and quickly. The next day, Ælfgifu called a council of war. All of her closest advisors were present, including Edric, who had become one of her most trusted allies. She knew that she could not win this war without their support, but she also knew that she could not afford to show weakness. "We face a difficult choice," Ælfgifu said, her voice calm but firm. "The Danes are strengthening their position within York, and we are running out of time. Reinforcements will not arrive for at least a week. If we do not act soon, we risk losing the city altogether." Edric spoke up, his voice steady. "We cannot risk another direct assault. The Danes are too strong in the city. We need to wait for reinforcements." Ælfgifu nodded, but she could feel the tension in the room. She could sense the unease, the reluctance to follow her lead. She knew that this was her moment, the moment when she would either prove herself as a leader or lose everything. "I understand the risks," Ælfgifu said, her voice unwavering, "but we cannot afford to wait. If we do, the Danes will only grow stronger. We need to strike while we still have the advantage." There was silence in the room, and for a moment, Ælfgifu thought she might lose their support. But then, Edric stepped forward, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of respect and resolve. "You are right, Lady Ælfgifu," he said. "We will follow you. We fight together." The decision was made. Ælfgifu would lead her forces in one final attempt to reclaim York. The stakes could not be higher. Failure would mean the end of the rebellion and possibly her life. But with the support of her loyal men, Ælfgifu knew that there was still a chance for victory. The siege of York would not end in surrender. As the battle raged on, Ælfgifu felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her more heavily than ever. She knew that this was a turning point, not just in the fight for York, but in her own journey. She was no longer just the daughter of Ælfhelm. She was a leader, a symbol of resistance, and in the fires of war, she would forge her legacy. The siege of York had reached a new level of desperation. Ælfgifu's forces, battered but resolute, had launched a daring night assault in a final attempt to breach the city's walls. The element of surprise had worked for a short while, but now the Danes had regrouped, strengthening their defenses, and the Saxon rebellion was facing a dire crossroads. Each day that passed, it seemed that their hope of reclaiming York faded further. Ælfgifu had led her men into battle with courage, but the costs of war were beginning to weigh heavily on her. The casualties on both sides were mounting, and the once optimistic vision of victory now felt like a distant dream. Yet even as despair began to settle in, there was a fire in Ælfgifu's heart, a fire that refused to go out. She had inherited her father's spirit, and if that spirit meant a fight to the bitter end, then she would not falter. But the true battle, Ælfgifu soon realized, was not just against the Danes. It was against the forces of division within her own camp. In the days after the failed assault, as the surviving men regrouped at their temporary fortifications outside York, Ælfgifu sensed the growing discontent among her followers. The murmurs of dissent, which had once been whispers, were now open talks of rebellion. Her leadership was being questioned, her every decision scrutinized. For many of the Saxon lords, Ælfgifu was still a symbol of the old way, a relic of a time that had passed. Some of the younger men, eager for glory and power, had begun to view her as an obstacle rather than a leader. She could not ignore the tension that was slowly turning her army into a powder keg. The situation had grown dire. If Ælfgifu was to maintain control and prevent her forces from fracturing entirely, she needed to make difficult choices. The path of diplomacy had failed her. Now, it would be a battle not only of steel but of strategy and, perhaps, manipulation. One evening, as Ælfgifu sat in her tent, reviewing the battle plans with Edric and a few other trusted advisors, a familiar figure entered unannounced. It was the captain who had first questioned her leadership, a man by the name of Wulfric. He had been among the few who had openly spoken against her decisions in the past. and his presence now was enough to make the air heavy with suspicion. "I have news," Wulfric said bluntly, his voice low but filled with an unsettling confidence. Ælfgifu glanced up, her eyes narrowing. "What news?" she asked, though her heart already felt the stirrings of something dark. "There are men in your camp who have lost faith," Wulfric began. "They no longer believe in your leadership. They say you cannot win this war, that your rebellion is doomed. I believe it's time we consider other options." The weight of his words hit Ælfgifu like a cold wind. She had anticipated discontent, but hearing it spoken so openly brought it into sharp relief. Wulfric was not the only one who felt this way, and his words were a direct challenge to her authority. But it was not just Wulfric's discontent that troubled her. It was the fact that he had so many supporters among the younger captains. Edric, standing by her side, spoke before she could respond. "What do you mean? Other options?" "Wulfric." The captain's eyes flicked nervously toward Ælfgifu, as though gauging her response. "The Danes are too strong. You can't win this fight. Ælfgifu, if you do not change course, you will lose everything. Perhaps it is time to consider a new leader." A thick silence filled the tent. Edric's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, his face hardening. Ælfgifu, however, remained still, her expression unreadable. She knew that Wulfric's words were a test of her resolve. "Are you suggesting betrayal?" Ælfgifu asked quietly, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension. Wulfric hesitated for only a moment. "Not betrayal," he said quickly, "but survival. The Saxons are divided, and you know it. You cannot win with a divided army. If you wish to see your family's name restored, you must seek out a new course." Ælfgifu's mind raced, calculating the possible consequences of the offer Wulfric was dangling in front of her. He was right about one thing: the Saxons were divided. But she could not accept such an offer. If she allowed a single shred of disloyalty to fester, it would spell the end of the rebellion. "I will never betray my cause," Ælfgifu said, her voice firm, "and I will not bow to those who seek to divide us." Wulfric's lips curled into a smirk, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "Very well," he said, as if resigning himself to the fact that Ælfgifu was not an easy target. "But remember, Lady Ælfgifu, you cannot fight this war alone, not without the support of your people." With that, he turned and left the tent, his retreating footsteps leaving a heavy silence behind. The conversation with Wulfric had left Ælfgifu shaken, but not defeated. She had expected treachery, but hearing it spoken aloud in such a direct manner was still unsettling. She turned to Edric, whose eyes had not left the entrance since Wulfric's departure. "This rebellion is more fragile than I thought," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edric nodded, his expression grim. "You've earned the loyalty of many, Ælfgifu, but there are always those who seek their own gain. Wulfric's words may hold some truth. There is division, and that division is dangerous." Ælfgifu sat back, her mind working furiously. She could not afford to lose any more support, especially not from the men who had sworn allegiance to her. The Danes were formidable, and their control over York remained unbroken. But if she allowed her forces to fracture any further, victory would slip farther from her grasp. "I will not let this rebellion fall apart," Ælfgifu declared, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "I will take control of this situation, once and for all." In the days that followed, Ælfgifu took decisive action. She summoned her loyalists to a council and, one by one, made her case for why they must remain united. She did not shy away from confronting those who wavered in their loyalty. It was clear that she would have to show her strength, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of the Saxon cause. Her father's legacy was on the line, and she would not allow it to be destroyed by infighting. Wulfric's insurrection would not go unpunished. Ælfgifu knew that his ambition was a threat that could not be ignored. She would strike before he could strike at her. As she prepared for the next phase of the rebellion, She also made a plan to deal with those who had spoken against her leadership. But despite the danger of betrayal, Ælfgifu remained steadfast. She had come this far, and she would go further. There was no turning back. The tides of war had turned against her before, but this time, she would not allow them to break her. The days following the confrontation with Wulfric were filled with a tension that hung in the air like a storm about to break. Ælfgifu's decision to clamp down on dissent had made her even more determined. She had no choice but to act swiftly and decisively, for the consequences of allowing further division were too great to ignore. Her forces were already thinning, and every lost soldier, every broken alliance, was a blow that might prove fatal. It was not just Wulfric she had to worry about. His influence extended far beyond the campfires of her own army. There were whispers of his plotting, of his secret meetings with other discontented captains, some of whom had once sworn loyalty to Ælfgifu. And with the Danes tightening their hold on York, Ælfgifu knew that the rebellion could not afford internal strife for much longer. She gathered her closest advisors, Edric, Wulfric's former rival, and others who had remained loyal despite the temptation to follow the captain's call for a change in leadership. The air was thick with uncertainty as the council convened in her tent, his canvas flapping restlessly in the gusting wind. Ælfgifu sat at the head of the table, her mind sharp, yet weary. She had not slept properly in days, consumed by strategy, politics, and the looming threat of disintegration. "I have heard of more defections," Edric spoke quietly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes never leaving Ælfgifu's face. "More captains whispering about the possibility of joining the Danes. If we do not act soon, the rebellion will collapse under the weight of betrayal." Ælfgifu felt the weight of his words sink in, but she refused to show the depth of her fear. She had always known that leadership was fraught with dangers, but the scale of this betrayal was something she had not anticipated. She had to hold firm for her people, for her family, and for the legacy of her father. "I will not lose this rebellion to treachery," Ælfgifu said, her voice steady. "We will not allow Wulfric's treason to divide us. The Danes are already on the offensive. They will sense weakness in our ranks, and if we do not act decisively, they will crush us." The room fell silent as the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them were already beginning to wonder if the price of loyalty was worth it. Ælfgifu knew what had to be done, but the cost would be high. In the end, it would take not only military strategy but the delicate art of power politics to preserve her leadership. She would have to make an example of those who sought to undermine her. "We need to consolidate our strength," Ælfgifu continued, looking each of her advisors in the eye. "We will strike before they can move against us. I'll send a message to Olaf, demanding that he send reinforcements. But we cannot wait. If we are to take York back, it must be now." The advisors nodded reluctantly. The path ahead was clear, but uncertain. The timing was critical. If they could outmaneuver Wulfric's faction and launch a decisive assault on York, they might still have a chance. But that was a big if. In the days that followed, Ælfgifu issued orders to her commanders, preparing them for an assault unlike any they had attempted before. The Saxon forces were divided into smaller units to strike from multiple directions, each led by a trusted captain. Ælfgifu herself would lead the vanguard, a signal of her unwavering commitment to the cause. She could not allow any weakness to show. She would fight as though she had nothing left to lose. But the preparations for war were not the only matters weighing on her mind. Behind the scenes, Ælfgifu's spies worked tirelessly to monitor Wulfric's movements. The captain's actions were becoming increasingly suspicious, and Ælfgifu knew that the time had come for him to be dealt with. She could no longer afford to allow this cancer to spread. On the eve of the planned assault, as the men readied their weapons and armor, Ælfgifu convened a secret meeting with her most trusted allies. Edric, her longtime confidant, was the first to enter the tent, his face grim. "It's time," he said quietly. "We've confirmed Wulfric's treachery. He's already in talks with the Danes. He intends to hand York over to them." Ælfgifu nodded, her jaw tight. "Then it's decided. He must be eliminated before the battle begins." The order was swift. Edric, who had always been a man of action, gathered a small group of loyal warriors and set out to find Wulfric. The captain had made the mistake of underestimating Ælfgifu's resolve. In his desire to betray her, he had underestimated the strength of the woman he had once served. As the night wore on, the camp prepared for the next day's battle. The men slept fitfully, unaware of the storm brewing within their ranks. Ælfgifu sat in her tent, her eyes fixed on the battle plans she had drawn. But as the moon climbed higher into the sky, her thoughts kept drifting back to Wulfric. She knew he had once been a friend, comrade in arms. But now, he was nothing more than a threat to her vision of a united Saxon kingdom. Hours later, Edric returned, his face grim. Wulfric was dead, his throat slit in the dead of night by his own men. The traitor's body discarded outside the camp. It had been swift, decisive, and, most importantly, final. Wulfric's betrayal had been stamped out before it could spread, but at a terrible cost. Ælfgifu could feel the shift in the air. Her victory was bitter. The weight of the decision to eliminate a man who had once been a part of her rebellion was not something she could easily dismiss. Yet, she knew it was the price of leadership. The next morning, Ælfgifu's forces began the final march to York. The men who had remained loyal rallied behind her, their spirits reignited by her strength and determination. The Saxons were ready, and despite the internal strife, they moved forward with a singular purpose: to reclaim their city, to restore their legacy. As they neared the gates of York, Ælfgifu felt the weight of history pressing down on her. This was the moment that would define her, that would either solidify her as the leader of a new kingdom or consign her to failure. But despite the doubts that still haunted her, she pressed on, leading her men toward the gates of the city that had once been her birthright. The Danes, sensing the shift in the Saxon forces, were already preparing for battle. They had underestimated Ælfgifu before, but this time, she was no longer just a daughter of a nobleman. She was the warrior queen of Northumbria, and the world would know it soon enough. The final march to York was both a beginning and an end. The city that Ælfgifu had once known, the city that had been her family's home, now stood before her as a battlefield, a symbol of both triumph and tragedy. Her forces, though smaller and scarred by the internal divisions of the past weeks, were determined. Ælfgifu had crushed the dissent in her ranks, proving her indomitable will. She had united them once more, binding them together with the promise of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. But as they approached York, the reality of what lay ahead settled heavily on Ælfgifu's heart. She knew that the city was no longer merely a place to be captured. It had become a symbol of all that had gone wrong in the Saxon world. The Danes had entrenched themselves in the heart of York, and it was a city that would not easily surrender. The first signs of battle came in the early hours of the morning, when the sun had barely begun to rise and the first rays of light were breaking over the eastern horizon. The Saxons, led by Ælfgifu, gathered in battle formation on the rolling hills outside the city walls. The Danes, no strangers to bloodshed, were ready for a siege. The streets of York were filled with the heavy sounds of preparation: footsteps, the clinking of armor, the sharpening of blades. The tension was palpable. Ælfgifu could hear the beating of her own heart in her ears, drowned out only by the distant shouts of warriors ready for battle. As the Saxon forces advanced, Ælfgifu could see the outline of the Danish army on the city's ramparts. Their banners fluttered in the wind, a visual reminder of the power they had held over the north for so long. But Ælfgifu had been through too much to turn back now. She could feel the weight of history bearing down on her, the weight of her father's legacy, the weight of her own promise to the people of York. The battle that ensued was brutal. The Saxon forces, though smaller, were relentless, Driven by the fire of reclaiming their homeland, Ælfgifu herself led the charge, her sword cutting through the air with the precision of a woman who had spent her life in battle. The first wave of Saxon soldiers breached the city's gates, and the roar of triumph was quickly followed by the clash of steel and the cries of the wounded. Despite their courage, the Saxons were no match for the fortified position the Danes held. The battle raged for hours, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. The Danes, however, had the upper hand in terms of resources, reinforcements, and experience. Ælfgifu, though a fierce leader, knew that time was running out. They had no reserves to call upon, and the Danes' numbers were overwhelming. As the day wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. Ælfgifu's forces, exhausted and demoralized by the heavy casualties, began to falter. The Danes pressed forward, their battle lines tightening, their war cries growing louder. Ælfgifu, bloodied and covered in the dust of the battlefield, fought with every ounce of strength she had left. But she knew the end was near. In a final desperate move, Ælfgifu ordered a retreat. Her men, those still standing, withdrew from the city gates under a rain of arrows and javelins. As they pulled back, Ælfgifu's heart broke at the sight of her fallen soldiers, some who had fought with such loyalty to her, others who had died for a cause that seemed ever more impossible with each passing hour. Her retreat was not a defeat in spirit, but it was a crushing blow to her hopes. York was lost, and with it, the dream of a unified Saxon kingdom. The days following the battle were somber ones. Ælfgifu and her remaining forces found refuge in the countryside, far from the wreckage of York. Her dreams of reclaiming her birthright lay shattered at her feet. Yet, even in defeat, Ælfgifu remained resolute. She had led her people with courage, and though she had failed to reclaim York, she had not given up. There was no shame in her actions, only the harsh reality of war. For weeks after the defeat, Ælfgifu wrestled with the implications of the battle. The Danes had defeated them, but they had not broken her spirit. There were still Saxon territories to defend, still cities to fight for. Her vision of a Saxon kingdom, though wounded, was far from dead. Ælfgifu understood now that leadership meant more than just holding a city or winning a battle. It meant preserving the will of the people and continuing the fight, even when the odds were stacked against you. In the quiet moments of reflection, Ælfgifu often thought of her father. She had spent her entire life under his shadow, determined to carry on his legacy. But now, in the aftermath of battle, she realized something that changed her understanding of her place in history. Her father had been a ruler of men, a conqueror of lands. But Ælfgifu, though she might never wear a crown or reclaim York, was a different kind of leader. She had fought for a cause greater than her own ambitions. She had fought for the people who believed in her and her vision, and she had shown them that even in defeat, there was honor. Years passed, and Ælfgifu's name became a legend, one that was spoken of in hushed tones in the halls of both the Saxons and the Danes. Her life was a tale of perseverance, of striving against overwhelming odds, and of refusing to bow to the pressures of power and betrayal. Though she did not reclaim York, she left behind a legacy of defiance and leadership. Ælfgifu eventually withdrew from the frontline battles, no longer seeking power for its own sake but seeking instead a quiet, lasting peace for her people. She returned to her ancestral lands, where she spent her final years reflecting on the great struggle that had defined her life. In the end, Ælfgifu found solace not in the victories that might have been, but in the understanding that leadership was about more than just winning battles. It was about enduring, about standing tall in the face of adversity, and about knowing that even when one's hopes seemed lost, the fight was never truly over. Her story would be remembered for generations, not as a tale of kings and kingdoms, but as a story of one woman's indomitable spirit, of one leader who had never stopped fighting for what she believed in. Thus, the legacy of Ælfgifu of York was secured, not in the walls of a conquered city, but in the hearts of the people who had followed her. and in the history she had made by never surrendering her ideals. No matter the cost, she had fought for her people, for the past and future of Saxon Britain. And in the end, it was not the battles she won that defined her. It was the ones she had fought with all her heart.